Hi, this is Christopher Schwarz, one of the authors of the book, The Joiner and Cabinet Maker, and this is the audio slideshow to the Schoolbox. The Schoolbox is probably my favorite project in the book. Though it's just a simple dovetailed box, the lessons it gives you are basically everything you need to know to build yourself a blanket chest. Now, the little till you can see up there inside the box is very blanket chest-esque, except in this case it was designed for holding the students' snacks. Once you get through this, you are going to be fully prepared to tackle the large project in this book, which is the chest of drawers. So, without any more mumbling on my part, let's get started. Here you can see some of the planks of eastern white pine that I chose for this project, and a pair of gloves. Now, that pair of gloves was not designed to protect me from splinters, but rather from mammal poo. When we pulled these boards from the barn where we found them, one of the boards was covered with an enormous pile of something organic. We left that board there. We're going to begin by gluing up a panel here, this one for the bottom. What's really interesting about the book is that Thomas glues up his panels while the wood is in the rough. Normally we surface all our wood these days before we glue up the panels. I decided to go Thomas style here. The really difficult part about it is learning to read the grain of the wood so that you can glue up a good looking panel. And it's even harder to do that while it's in the rough, but you get used to it. I heated up this hide glue pretty good to try to do a rub joint, and put the hide glue on there and then put on the mating piece, rubbed it back and forth until the glue started to tack, and then Thomas would have just left the panel alone. I couldn't help myself, and I put a clamp across it and left it overnight. The next day, the joiner and cabinet maker instructs you to remove the gelled squeeze out. I did that with a chisel, wielded bevel up in this case. You can do it either way. Bevel up works better for me. Thomas took the leftover glue bits and put them back into the glue pot. I didn't. Now, to prepare this panel, the first step you need to do is you need to flatten it by working directly across the grain from left to right on your screen. This is what's called traversing. Now, before you can traverse any piece of wood, you really should bevel off that outfeed side corner with your jack plane. That will prevent what is called spelching, which is the fun English word for blowout. Here I am checking the board to see where my high spots and low spots are. Generally, your plane is a good enough measuring tool in this instance. And here I am going to town on this panel by traversing from left to right across your screen. Traversing is a wonderful traditional hand tool technique, first explained, to my knowledge, by Joseph Moxon in Mechanic Exercises. Traversing allows you to take a very heavy cut while limiting the depth of the tear out, because you are cutting across the grain fibers instead of along the grain fibers, which is where they're stronger. Here you can see some of the really thick shavings brought up by traversing. This technique allows you to really take a deep cut, sometimes as thick as 1/8 of an inch, with a soft wood and a really wide plane. Once you have traversed the panel and gotten it cleaned up, it's time to get out your straight edge or your winding sticks, depending on your perspective. Here I am checking the board diagonally with a wooden straight edge. If by checking it diagonally, I can look for humps at the corners. A real common problem. Once I see where my problem areas are, I start working the panel diagonally with my jointer plane, which is what they call a tri-plane in the joiner and cabinet maker. Working diagonally really allows you to flatten things out because more of the plane sole touches more of the board's surface all over. And if you look really closely here on the right side of the screen, you can see some of that spelching that I was talking about. Now, one of the really interesting techniques that was explained in the joiner and cabinet maker is how to determine if one of your panels is indeed flat. Instead of using winding sticks, instead of using some other dodge, the joiner and cabinet maker says you should check one flat surface against another surface to see if the other surface is in wind. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm taking a known flat surface in my hands and placing it on top of the surface I'm working. With that known flat surface on top, I then sort of rock the panel at the corners to see if this flat panel will rock on the panel I'm working. Here I am checking the other corners. And once I know how the panel is rocking, I can mark the two high corners. Now, the way wood works is generally you're going to have boards that twist. So you're going to have two high corners and two low corners. It's not always the case, but generally if you look for this, you'll find it. And once I know my high spots, I can then work locally to remove them down to the lower areas of the board. When I get all my panels flat on one face, then I can take my marking gauge here and score the finished thickness all the way on all four edges of all the panels. And then I simply work that opposite face, which is on the right, down to my scribe line. When I'm hit the scribe line, I'm done. With all my panels flat on both sides, then I trim them to length. That's what I'm doing here. I'm using my shooting board sort of as an oversized bench hook, and I'm using a sash saw to trim down to my line. You can be really accurate with hand sawing. If you look really closely, I hope your TV can show this resolution. You can see half of my pencil line left at the top of the board there. Now, this is a good cut, but we can make it better, and we're going to do that with a shooting board. Shooting boards allow you to trim the edges and ends of boards completely square, and that's what I'm doing here. You work up against a fence, and the plane rides in a track back and forth. Now I'm using a modern jack plane here, but just about any plane will do, as long as it has a lot of mass. Really lightweight planes, such as block planes, are not suited for shooting such as this. That's because they don't have enough mass to really stay in the cut. And as you can see here, the shooting board leaves a really nice surface. Now all my panels are the correct thickness, width, and length, so I can begin dovetailing. The first step is to mark my baselines. How far in should these baselines be? Well, Thomas uses exactly the thickness of the work. Some people use a little more, some people use a little less. I would encourage you to try exactly the thickness. Thomas cuts his dovetails by sawing out the pins first. You can go either way. Don't let anybody tell you any different. In fact, like me, you can learn both perspectives and use whichever one suits you. Once you saw the shape of the pins, there are several options to remove the waste. The old school method is to simply bash it out with a chisel halfway through, as I'm doing right here. It involves a few really sharp knocks. I usually start my knocking about a 1/16 away from my baseline and work backwards. The chisel will tend to pull back towards the baseline, so you don't want to start on the baseline. After you remove enough waste, you can then drop the tip of your chisel into the baseline and pare straight down. Work halfway through the board, all the way across its width. Then flip the board over and work from the other side. By working from both faces and into the middle, you avoid blowing out some of the end grain in a place that will show. Now stand up your pin board on top of your tail board and transfer the marks with a pencil. This is really easy to do with short pieces, such as those you would find on this Schoolbox. It becomes a little more involved when you get into big case pieces, but there are ways around it, which we discuss in the book, The Joiner and Cabinet Maker. Then transfer your pencil lines from the face onto the end grain. Saw out your tail cuts. And bash out the waste with a narrow chisel. Some modern woodworkers, such as myself, like to saw out that waste between the tails or the pins. Now, Joel Moskowitz, the other author of the Joiner and Cabinet Maker book, calls sawing out the waste a modern complication. I like to think of it as a modern convenience. Either way, it works fine. Try both, decide for yourself. Sawing out the little bits of waste on the end of your tailboard is a critical operation because this area will show, especially at the top of the box. So I like to use what Robert Waring calls a first-class saw cut, and that is where you create a small trench on your edge by making a V-cut with your chisel. Here's that little V-cut. Now the saw will go in that little trench and will guide the tool straight down to the tail cut. And this is what you get in the end. You can see the mark all the way around where my cutting gauge scored the baseline. What is left there in the middle usually could be put together with the pin board and look pretty good. However, if you want to, you can get in there and pare away some of that fur with a chisel. However, you are incurring a risk that you'll overcut. Here I am test fitting the joint. As you can see on the right upper side, my tails are a little recessed, and on the left side, my tails are a little proud. I'm not too worried because this is pretty much the result of sizing all your stock by hand. Once the whole thing is glued up, I'm going to true it all up and it'll look perfect. When I glue up, I like to use lots of glue, not only on the long grain surfaces of the tails and pins, but also on the end grain surfaces. Now, modern woodworking says that you shouldn't even bother because there's no strength there. But I will tell you that our tests have shown that the end grain does offer strength, and in casework you need all the strength you can get. With my case glued up, the next thing to do is I want to dress all 4 outside surfaces so they are completely true and are ready to receive the molding and the lid and the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a platform on my bench that allows me to sleeve the case over that piece of plywood and work against my leg vise. Here's the case sleeved over that platform, and what I'm doing here is I'm about to put some alcohol on the end grain surfaces to soften them up and make them easier to plane. I like to use alcohol because it doesn't have a lot of volatile organic compounds in it. Some people use mineral spirits. Some other people will use water. I don't like to use water because I try to keep water away from my iron and steel tools. The first thing I do is I level all the joints at the corners, working from the outside in. And when you work with a wood such as Eastern White Pine, you can work regardless of grain direction, and that's a real advantage to the wood. You don't have to use a block plane. Pretty much any plane will do as long as it's sharp. Now, if I'm just going for appearances on the outside of a case, I won't bother with the joiner plane. But if I'm going to attach molding to it, I really need the surfaces true, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm working with the joiner plane, and what I'm doing is planing into the middle of the case and then sort of lifting off, and then working from the other side. And that keeps me from spelching the end grain surfaces at the corners. Here I am lifting up with the smoothing plane in the middle of my cut. Now, the important thing to do here is to check your work. Even though you are lifting up, you shouldn't just trust that you're getting it true. You should get out your wooden straight edge and confirm that you aren't making or leaving some mountain in the middle. If you are, work that middle part down until you get it completely flat. The same rules apply when you deal with the end grain on the tailboards. Here I am working from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen with a block plane, and as soon as the ends of those tails are brought down to the surface of the ends, I stop, and then I start working from the ends and into the middle as I did on the other surfaces. And here's the end result. I don't have any spelching on my corners, and everything is nice and crisp. Now that the case is sized, I can attach the bottom. You'll notice here at the bottom that the bottom's a little bigger than the case, and that's a good thing. So I nail it and glue it down, and then I trim it to shape all the way around. You'll also notice a weird thing, which is that the grain runs from the front to the back. Now that's something we deal with in some detail in the book, The Joiner and Cabinet Maker. I might get some wood movement problems here in later years. This is how Thomas did it. Here I am setting the nails on the bottom with a fancy pants spring-loaded nail punch that I filed to the shape of my cut headless brads. My friend Bob Lang says that using one of these is sort of like showing up to a job site while wearing a dress. And finally, I'm trimming the bottom to size. Note that I'm using a smoothing plane to cut end grain. You don't have to have some low angle plane to cut end grain. That's sort of a myth. What really counts is that the tool is sharp, because sharp fixes everything. And now I am making my molding that will wrap around the bottom of the case, and I'm chamfering one corner using a little chamfer guide on a block plane. You can do this freehand, but if you do it freehand, I would advise you to do your molding all in one long length and then cutting it to length to wrap around your case. That way the corners will meet up. Now, the easiest way to cut this molding is just to mark the line and cut the line, and then take a sharp plane and plane down to the line, which is what I'm doing here. These miters are fairly forgiving because they don't have to wrap all the way around on 4 sides of the box, only on 3. And then you glue and nail the molding in place. Don't forget to put glue on the mitered section, and be sure to nail the miters, because that's where problems occur. Now we can turn our attention to the inside of the case, particularly the dados that are used for holding the partition inside. Now, Thomas simply marks them out with a knife and cuts them with a small dovetail saw and chisels out the waste, but I'm a little more particular, or maybe a little less skilled. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this block of wood, the MDF you see on the screen, and use that as a saw guide. And here I am with what Katie calls my fancy saw, working up against the piece of MDF and sawing out the extent of the dado. Note that it's okay to overcut past your line, because it'll never show. And then I move the block or get a different block and saw the other extent of the dado, and this is what the result looks like at the end with the fancy saw. Now, to trim the end of the dado, my chisels were too long to get inside the case, and I don't have a butt chisel or anything special to get in there, so I just used my cutting gauge and simply scored the end of the dado. Worked great. This is how Thomas removed the waste from the dado. He used a chisel and simply hogged it out. Now, if you're going to do this, I would recommend chiseling out each corner of the waste, leaving sort of a mountain in the middle, and then removing the mountain in the middle. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I've got a chisel that's the same width of my dado, and I'm pushing it from the top of the case in to the bottom of the dado. Now, a modern woodworker, such as myself, would use a router plane to skim the bottom of the dado, and this provides a consistent depth all the way down. With the dados complete, I can start to fit the partition. The first thing to do is to shoot the partition so it's the exact length that I need, and then I can start working the faces of the partition until it snugs inside the dados. Now, I don't really mess much with the dados when I do this, and the reason is that it's much easier to plane the face grain of the partition than it is to mess with the end grain. Here I've got the partition wall complete, and I'm gluing the bottom of the partition to the partition wall. Then I pulled the partition out of the school box and nailed the bottom to the partition wall. With all that work done, I can then put the partition back in, mark exactly where the bottom meets the front and back of the school box, then pull the partition out and see exactly where the cleat should go, then nail them in place. Then I put the partition back in and trim the top of the partition wall so that it fits completely flush with the top of the school box. If you're going to install a lock set in the school box, the thing you need to be most mindful of is the pin. Now, the pin is that squarish piece of brass that the key turns on. Now, you want to take the lock set and press it into the front of the school box, exactly where the lock set's going to go, and that square pin will leave an indentation. Then you want to take your bradawl, bore a hole through the front of the school box until the lock set will press fit into that hole. Then clamp the lock set into that pinhole and use a square to knife in where that top plate is going to go. And then I use a cutting gauge to score the width of the top of the lock set. I can score that waist and remove it with a router plane. And then remove the rest of the waist for the lock set. I placed the lock set on here, traced around it, and now I'm sawing out the extents of the mortise for the guts of the lock. Here I am scoring it with a drawer lock chisel, which is a specialized tool designed for this sort of work. Then it's just a matter of completing the job by scoring around for the back plate of the lock set and screwing it in place. The hinges for the school box are simple strap hinges made from steel. Now, you're not going to find some that have the particular bend in them right where you need them, so just buy ones with straight leaves and then bend them in a vise. It's really not hard. The first thing to do, though, is to cut the mortise for the hinges in the back wall of the school box. With the mortise cut, you then bore a pilot hole and screw the hinge with the unbent leaf in place and mark where that bend should occur on the bottom side of the leaf. Secure the leaf in your metal vise and bend it with some few judicious taps of your hammer. You can always undo the job a couple times until the leaf will snap, so don't be too worried. Then put your school box on its back and secure the lid with just 2 screws as shown here. By securing it with 2 screws, you can then lift the lid into place on the school box and shift it around ever so slightly until you get the exact overhang you want. Then add the rest of the screws and put the beveled molding around the top lid. Also easy, it's done just the same as the bottom molding. The strike for the lock set is also easy to install. You simply take the strike, shown at the top of the screen there, and then fasten it to the lock. Then drop the lid onto the strike, and the 2 little nubbins there will make 2 little dents in the top of your lid. Then you can simply remove the strike, trace around where the strike should go, and start chiseling it out. It's really quite simple work, as you can see here. I hope you enjoyed our audio slideshow of the Schoolbox. It's a really nice looking project, fairly simple and straightforward skills, and I hope you've also got the confidence to take on the large project, the third and final in the Joiner and Cabinet Maker, the chest of drawers.